At 92 years old, the world had decided it was done with Samuel. It sent its notice in the form of two people who smelled of city smoke and impatience, their polished boots scuffing the dust he had known as a floor for 70 years. They stood in the doorway of his cabin, their crisp clothing a stark insult to the sun-bleached, wind-scoured wood of his home. The man, Alistair Thorne, held a rolled map like a scepter, his eyes sweeping over the sparse interior with a predatory disinterest. His wife, Beatrice, stood slightly behind him, her face a mask of bored disdain, fanning herself with a gloved hand against the oppressive summer heat that pressed in from the vast, empty plains. They did not see a home. They saw an obstacle. They did not see a man who had outlived empires and droughts. They saw a relic to be cleared away. This land, every fissure and rock formation of it, was etched into the lines of his face. Yet they spoke of it as if it were a blank page upon which their grand future would be written. They spoke of progress, a word that sounded like a death sentence. They planned to lay steel tracks for their railroad, a screaming iron snake that would cut directly through his life, his memories, and the very ground where his wife was buried. They saw only a line on a map, a path of least resistance from one profitable point to another. And he, Samuel, at 92, was the resistance. They thought him a weed to be plucked, a stubborn stone to be kicked aside. They had no idea that the oldest stones have the deepest roots, and that inside this forgotten cabin, a truth was sleeping in the dust, a truth powerful enough to shatter their steel-clad dreams. You have felt it, haven't you? That moment you are looked through, not at. The moment your history, your work, your very soul is deemed an inconvenience. They will try to tell you that you are finished. They will try to build their future over your past. But they do not know what you have stored away, what quiet power you have nurtured in the silence, waiting for the day it is needed most. The man, Alistair, finally spoke, his voice as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. The survey is complete. The rail line will pass through this quadrant. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. He did not ask. He did not negotiate. He pronounced. The words hung in the thick, hot air, buzzing like flies around a carcass. Samuel stood by the cold hearth, his hands resting on the worn wood of the mantelpiece. His knuckles were swollen, the geography of a long, hard life mapped out in purple veins and scar tissue. He did not tremble. He did not rage. The fire that had once burned hot in his youth had long ago banked into something far more enduring, embers of pure, unyielding resolve. At 92, he had learned that the loudest storms were rarely the most dangerous. It was the silence afterward that held the real power. He met Alistair's gaze, his own eyes the color of a faded prairie sky, and held it until the younger man shifted, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. "This land is not for sale," Samuel said, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder that had been traveling for a century to arrive at this moment. Beatrice scoffed, a brittle, ugly sound. "We are not buying it, old man. We are taking it. Progress has a price, and your sentimental attachment is not part of the equation progress." There was that word again. To them, it meant noise and speed and money. To him, it meant the slow, sacred cycle of sun and moon, of seed and harvest, of life and death. His wife, Eleanor, was buried under the lone cottonwood tree out back. Was her final resting place also part of the equation? He thought of her hands, not soft and gloved like Beatrice's, but calloused and clever, hands that could read the story of a stone or coax a garden from the unforgiving earth. They had built this cabin together, log by painstaking log, their laughter sealing the gaps better than any mortar. Every notch in the wood was a memory. Every worn plank in the floor was a testament. The breaking point was not the threat, nor the insult. It was the casual erasure of it all. Alistair unrolled his map on Samuel's small table, the paper crackling with importance. A thick, merciless black line bisected the drawing of his property. It ran straight through the cabin, over the well, and across the gentle rise where Eleanor lay. It was a wound inflicted on paper, a promise of the real wound to come. "As you can see, it is a matter of engineering, not emotion," Alistair said, tapping the line with a manicured finger. The gradient is perfect. Any deviation would cost us a fortune. He spoke as if a fortune was the most sacred thing in the universe, the only God worth worshipping. Samuel looked from the map to the man's face, and for the first time, he felt a cold, quiet rage begin to stir within him. It was the rage of a mountain being told it was in the way. They saw a straight line. They didn't see the hidden aquifer that Eleanor had found, the one that fed his well even in the driest years. They didn't see the complex network of shale just beneath the surface, a brittle foundation that she had warned him about. They saw a flat, empty space because their minds were flat and their souls were empty. They packed up their map, their pronouncements of doom complete. 30 days, Alistair repeated, his final word a nail hammered into the coffin of Samuel's life. They turned and walked away, their shadows long and sharp in the afternoon sun, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any shout. The world had declared him obsolete. The future was coming, and it had no room for him. He stood in the doorway, watching them disappear into the shimmering heat haze, a solitary figure against an indifferent sky. The battle had been declared, but his enemy had no idea what kind of war they had just started. After they were gone, a profound stillness descended, broken only by the drone of cicadas and the frantic beating of his own heart. The stakes their surveyor had driven into the earth stood like tiny, mocking gravestones, marking the path of his undoing. He walked the perimeter of his home, his hand tracing the rough bark of the logs. 70 years. He had arrived here a young man, full of fire and dreams, with Eleanor by his side. Now he was an old man, full of memories and aches, and he was utterly alone. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, the kind of beautiful, lonely sunset that breaks a person's heart. He sat on his porch step, the wood warm beneath him, and watched the darkness gather in the hollows of the land. This was the dark night, not of the soul, for his soul was forged of tougher material, but of the body. At 92, despair was a physical weight. It settled in his joints, a dull, grinding ache that resonated with the weariness of his spirit. His bones felt brittle, his muscles thin and frayed. The sheer, overwhelming effort required to fight these people, to dismantle their monstrous certainty, felt impossible. He was one man, an old man. They were an engine of commerce, a force of nature as implacable as a flood or a fire. What could he possibly do? He could not outrun them. He could not outbuy them. He could not outfight them. The law, he knew, was a tool for men like Alistair Thorne, a complex machine designed to protect wealth and power, not justice for an old man on a forgotten scrap of land. The feeling of utter helplessness was a poison, seeping into his blood, slowing his thoughts. He thought of packing a few meager belongings and just walking away, vanishing into the wilderness. But where would he go? This cabin, this land, was the only world he had ever known. It was his anchor, his history, his testament. To leave it would be to surrender his own existence. As true night fell, bringing a merciful, if slight, drop in temperature, Samuel retreated inside. The cabin was dark, filled with the ghosts of a shared lifetime. He didn't light the lamp. He preferred the shadows, the familiar shapes of their simple furniture, the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs that clung to the very walls. He ran his hand over the back of Eleanor's rocking chair, its gentle creak a phantom of her presence. It was in this moment of profound desolation, surrounded by the echoes of his loss, that his gaze fell upon the floor. Near the hearth, one of the wide pine planks sat just slightly uneven, a detail no one but he would ever notice. It was the disagreement plank, Eleanor had called it. Whenever they had a rare but serious argument, one of them would work their frustration out on that plank, prying it up, checking the small space beneath, and then nailing it back down again, the physical act a strange ritual of reconciliation. They hadn't used it in decades. He hadn't thought about it since she passed. Driven by an impulse he didn't understand, a flicker of something that wasn't quite hope but was no longer despair, he found his old pry bar. His back screamed in protest as he knelt, the floorboards cold against his knees. With a groan of effort and a screech of old nails, the plank came loose. He reached into the small, dark cavity beneath. He expected nothing, maybe a dried mouse nest or just the cool, packed earth. Instead, his fingers brushed against the smooth, worn texture of oiled leather. He pulled it out. It wasn't a bag of gold or a deed or a weapon. It was a heavy, leather-bound folio, tied with a faded ribbon. And beneath it, a series of rolled, hand-drawn maps, their paper aged to the color of cream. He knew instantly what they were. It was Eleanor's last project. Her great obsession. A complete, exhaustive geological and hydrological survey of their land and the surrounding 100 miles. The secret life of the earth, she had called it. He had thought it was just her passion, her hobby. He never realized it was an arsenal. He carried the folio and the maps to the table, his hands trembling for the first time that day. He lit the oil lamp, and the small cabin filled with a warm, flickering glow. The light chased the deepest shadows into the corners, and with them, some of the crushing weight on his chest. He carefully untied the ribbon on the folio. The leather cover fell open to reveal page after page of Eleanor's elegant, precise handwriting, accompanied by detailed sketches of rock strata, soil composition charts, and water table measurements. It was a language he had learned from her over 50 years of marriage, the secret grammar of the ground beneath his feet. He had listened, half attending, as she spoke of anticlines and synclines, of porous sandstone and impermeable shale. Now her words, her knowledge, rose from the pages like a ghost, speaking to him with a new and desperate urgency. He unrolled the first map. It was a topographical rendering of his land, but with an intricate, almost overwhelming level of detail. She had marked the fault lines, the mineral deposits, the hidden springs. And then he saw it. A series of annotations, made in a stark red ink he rarely saw her use. They followed the exact path the railroad surveyors had staked out. Next to the drawing of the cabin, she had written, subsurface shale layer, highly unstable, prone to fracture under rhythmic vibration, catastrophic failure likely. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a warning. It was a prophecy. Alistair Thorne, in his arrogant pursuit of the perfect, flat gradient, had chosen the single most dangerous path his railroad could take. He had mistaken a facade of stability for the real thing, a mistake Eleanor's careful, patient science had uncovered years ago. She had seen the hidden weakness, the secret fragility of the land that appeared so solid and unyielding. It was a perfect mirror for how the Thorns saw him. A simple, solid obstacle easily removed, with no understanding of the complex, resilient history just beneath the surface. He spent the next 3 days and nights immersed in her work. Sleep was a fleeting necessity, food an afterthought. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist. There was only the lamplight, the rustle of old paper, and Eleanor's voice speaking to him across the years. He traced her drawings with his gnarled finger, relearning the land he thought he knew. He saw not just a pasture, but a deep basin of rich alluvial soil. He saw not just a dry creek bed, but a seasonal channel fed by a deep, reliable aquifer she had painstakingly mapped. On another map, a larger one of the entire region, she had marked a massive deposit of high-quality clay just a half-mile to the east, on a section of his property the surveyors had ignored completely. Perfect for ceramics, she had written in the margin, or for lining a reservoir. Holds water like a cup, a reservoir. The idea sparked in his mind, a tiny flame in the darkness of his predicament. He looked from the warning about the unstable shale to the promise of the hidden aquifer and the clay deposit. A plan began to form, not a plan of attack, but a plan of creation. He would not fight their railroad on their terms, with lawyers and petitions. He would not try to convince them with Eleanor's data. Men like Thorne did not listen to truths that inconvenienced them. No, he would build something. He would use Eleanor's knowledge to prove the land's true purpose. He would demonstrate a value far greater than a simple right-of-way. He would not stop their future. He would build a better one right under their noses. The despair that had crippled him was gone, burned away by the quiet fire of her legacy and his own rekindled purpose. At 92, he was not at the end of his story. He was at the beginning of his most important chapter. His body still ached, but now it was an ache he could work with, an old engine groaning to life, ready for one last, great effort. The grind began at dawn the next day. Before the sun had even crested the eastern hills, Samuel was at the spot Eleanor had marked on her map with a simple X and the words "Sweet Water." 40 feet it was in a shallow basin, a place he'd always thought of as useless, where the ground was too rocky for grazing. To anyone else, it was worthless land. To Eleanor, and now to him, it was the source. He held his oldest shovel, its wooden handle worn smooth and dark from a lifetime of use. The metal was pitted and scarred, a tool that had buried friends, planted gardens, and dug the foundation of his own home. It felt like an extension of his own arm. The first thrust into the baked, compacted earth sent a jarring shock up through his wrists and into his shoulders. The ground was like iron. For a moment, the sheer, monumental task ahead of him threatened to swallow his newfound resolve. 40 feet. By hand. At his age. It was madness. But then he thought of Alistair Thorne's dismissive sneer. He thought of the black line drawn through his life. He gritted his teeth, bent his stiff back, and drove the shovel into the earth again. And again. And again. Each movement was a deliberate, measured act of defiance. It was a conversation with the earth, a negotiation of pain for progress. Sweat poured from him, stinging his eyes and soaking the collar of his worn shirt. The sun climbed higher, a merciless white eye in the vast blue sky, beating down on his stooped figure. He worked in a slow, sustainable rhythm, a rhythm born of a lifetime of knowing his own limits. He would dig for an hour, then rest for 15 minutes in the shade of a lone mesquite, drinking sparingly from his canteen. During those rests, he would study Eleanor's maps, her notes becoming his scripture. He was not just digging a hole. He was following her instructions, trusting in her science, in her love. Days bled into a week, then 2. His world shrank to the growing circle of excavated earth, the pile of dirt and rock beside it, and the relentless blue sky above. His hands, tough as old leather, blistered, then broke open, then bled. He cleaned them each night with salt water and wrapped them in strips of cloth, only to tear them open again the next morning. His back was a constant, screaming knot of pain. Every muscle in his body protested this late-life betrayal. There were moments, usually in the suffocating heat of midday or the deep, lonely quiet of the night, when the madness of his endeavor would press in on him. He would lie on his cot, every joint on fire, and wonder if he was just an old fool digging his own grave. But then he would remember Eleanor's faith in this land, in its hidden potential. He was not just digging for water. He was digging for her. He was proving her right. He was honoring her memory in the only way he knew how, with hard, honest, transformative work. He passed 10 feet, then 20. The earth changed, from hard-packed topsoil to layers of gravel and then to a dense, damp clay. It was exactly as her notes had predicted. This confirmation was a balm to his aching body, a fuel for his flagging spirit. He was on the right path. He was not lost. He was following a map laid out by the person who knew him and this land better than anyone. 25 days had passed since the Thorns' visit. He had 5 days left. He was 35 feet down, the walls of the hole rising high above him, the sky just a small circle of blue. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. He was exhausted, thinner than he'd been in years, but a strange energy propelled him forward. It was the energy of imminent discovery. He was close. He could feel it. On the 27th day, it happened. The tip of his shovel struck something different. It wasn't the dull thud of rock or the soft suck of clay. It was a wet, yielding sound. He drove the shovel in again, and this time, when he pulled it back, the hole did not stay empty. A dark, muddy water began to seep slowly from the earth. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain, and watched, his heart pounding against his ribs. It wasn't a gush, not a flood, but a steady, persistent welling up of life. He touched the water. It was cool and clean. He laughed, a raw, cracked sound he hadn't made in years. It echoed strangely in the confines of his well. He had done it. He had reached Eleanor's aquifer. He spent the rest of the day widening the base, allowing the water to pool. By evening he had 2 feet of clear, sweet water. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The next 2 days were a blur of frantic, purposeful activity. Following Eleanor's other instructions, he took his cart and made the half-mile trip to the clay deposit she had mapped. He dug out load after load of the smooth, gray material, his newfound well giving him the strength for the journey. He mixed the clay with water and began to line the walls of the well, packing it tight, creating an impermeable seal that would prevent collapse and keep the water pure. It was backbreaking work, but it was the work of a builder, not a victim. He was no longer just a man waiting for his life to be demolished. He was a man laying a new foundation. On the 30th day, the day the Thorns were due to return with their machines and their legal papers, Samuel did not pack. He did not prepare to flee. He washed the dirt from his body with the cool, clear water from his own well. He put on a clean shirt, and then he sat on his porch and he waited. The well was finished. A small, hand-cranked pump was affixed to the top. Beside it, a series of shallow irrigation ditches, also lined with clay, snaked out to a freshly tilled patch of earth, dark and damp and ready for planting. It was a small thing, a tiny speck of green and brown potential in the vast, sun-scorched landscape. But it was a beginning. It was a testament. It was an answer. They arrived at midday not in a simple carriage, but with a small entourage. Alistair and Beatrice Thorne led the way, followed by a grim-faced man with a portfolio of legal documents and 2 burly workers ready to begin the process of demolition. They rode up to the cabin, their expressions a mixture of impatience and certainty. They expected to find a defeated old man, perhaps already gone, or at best, a pathetic figure clinging to the last vestiges of his pointless defiance. They did not expect to see him sitting calmly on his porch, and they certainly did not expect to see the new, undeniable structure standing proudly beside the cabin. The stone and clay-lined well, its pump handle gleaming in the sun, and the impossible network of wet, dark earth stretching out from it. They pulled their horses to a halt, their confident strides broken. Beatrice was the first to speak, her voice sharp with confusion. "What is that?" she asked, pointing a gloved finger at the well. Alistair's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. He saw not just a well, but the evidence of immense, improbable labor. He saw the piles of excavated rock, the discarded tools, the dark, damp soil that spoke of a water source he had been assured did not exist. His surveyors had told him the land was dry, useless. He dismounted, his movements stiff with anger. "What is this foolishness, old man? A last, desperate game?" Samuel did not rise. He simply looked at them, his gaze steady. "It's not a game," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the still air. "It's a foundation." He watched as the lawyer approached, his face a mask of professional intimidation. The man cleared his throat and began to read from a document, his voice droning on about eminent domain, railroad charters, and legal injunctions. The words were meaningless, the legal equivalent of the surveyor's stakes, an attempt to impose a false order on a world they did not understand. When the lawyer finished, a smug silence fell. Alistair crossed his arms, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "It is done. The law is on our side. Your well, your little garden plot, it is all irrelevant. Now, are you going to leave under your own power? Or will these men have to assist you?" This was the moment, the culmination of a month of pain and labor, of a lifetime of resilience. Samuel finally rose, slowly, every movement deliberate. He did not look at Alistair. Instead, he walked over to the well. He worked the handle of the pump, and with a rhythmic, squeaking sigh, a stream of clear, cold water poured forth, splashing onto the thirsty ground. The sight of it, the sound of it, was an undeniable miracle in this parched landscape. The 2 workers, who had been standing ready to drag him away, stared at the flowing water, their expressions of bored indifference replaced by something akin to awe. Water was life. It was a truth more fundamental than any law written on a piece of paper. "Your law is based on a lie," Samuel said. turning back to face them. "Your survey is a work of fiction." He walked back into his cabin and returned with Eleanor's folio and her red-inked map. He did not hand it to them. He spread it out on the porch railing, its aged paper a stark contrast to the Thorns' crisp, new documents. "My wife was a geologist," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, unshakable pride. "She knew this land. She mapped every rock, every fault, every drop of water hidden beneath it." He tapped the red line on the map. "She also mapped this, the path you have chosen. It is built directly over a layer of unstable shale. Your engineers, in their hurry, mistook it for granite bedrock. The rhythmic vibrations from your trains. She predicted it would cause a fracture within the first year. A derailment. A catastrophe." Alistair stared at the map, his face paling slightly. He snatched it from the railing, his eyes scanning Eleanor's meticulous notes, her precise, scientific script. He was a man who understood numbers, risks, and engineering. He could dismiss sentiment, but he could not dismiss credible data that threatened his entire enterprise. "This is a fabrication," he blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. Beatrice looked from the map to Samuel, a flicker of something, perhaps the first seed of respect, in her eyes. "And the water?" she asked, her voice softer now. "The surveyors said there was none." Samuel gestured to the well, then to the wider valley. "They looked for surface water. They didn't look deep enough," he said, the words carrying a double meaning that was lost on no one. "There is an aquifer beneath this entire basin. Enough water to support a town, not just a single cabin. There is a clay deposit to the east that can build 1,000 homes. This land isn't an obstacle for your railroad, Mr. Thorne. It was never meant for a railroad. Its value is something your survey could never measure." He paused, letting the truth settle in the hot, dry air. He no longer needed to fight them. He had already won. The land itself was his witness and his defense. He had not defied their law. He had simply revealed a higher, older one. The law of geology, of water, of life. He looked directly at Alistair, his gaze unwavering. "You can try to build your railroad here. You can lay your tracks and watch them crack. Or you can accept that you were wrong." The vindication was not loud or explosive. It was a quiet, profound certainty. He did not need their apology or their permission. He had his water. He had his land. He had his purpose. He had Eleanor's legacy. He had won back his own life, not by tearing something down, but by building something that would last. The Thorns and their men left in a cloud of dust and silent fury. Alistair held Eleanor's map, the proof of his folly, clutched in his fist. They did not look back. Weeks turned into months. The surveyor's stakes wilted under the sun, their bright plastic ribbons fading, until Samuel pulled them from the ground one by one and tossed them into his fire pit. Word of the railroad's sudden, expensive rerouting traveled slowly, carried on the winds with whispers and rumors. The story grew with each telling. The tale of the ancient rancher who had stared down the railroad barons, who had summoned water from stone. One afternoon, a wagon appeared on the horizon. It was not the polished carriage of the wealthy, but a battered, creaking cart pulled by 2 weary-looking mules. A man, a woman, and 2 small children sat on the wagon's bench, their faces etched with the hardship of a long and fruitless journey. They stopped a respectful distance from the cabin, the man climbing down and approaching cautiously, hat in hand. His name was Marcus, and his family was on the verge of collapse. Their homestead miles to the south had failed, their well running dry, their hopes turning to dust along with their crops. They had heard the stories. They didn't know if they were true, but they had to see. They were the observers, the first of the allies. Samuel did not greet them with suspicion. He saw in their sun-cracked faces the same desperation he had felt just months before. He simply nodded toward the pump. "The water is sweet," he said. The relief on the family's faces was a sight more beautiful than any sunset. They drank deeply, letting the cool water spill down their chins, a baptism of hope. That evening, Samuel did not just share his water. He shared his knowledge. He unrolled Eleanor's maps on his table, the lamplight illuminating the secrets of the earth for this new family. He showed Marcus the boundaries of the aquifer, the location of the best soil, the places where a foundation would hold firm. This was the beginning of the legacy. Marcus and his family did not move on. They built their own small cabin a quarter-mile down the basin, using clay from the deposit Eleanor had found to make strong, durable bricks. They dug their own well, guided by the map, and found water just as Samuel had. Soon, another family arrived, then another. They were all people who had been broken by the harshness of the land and the indifference of the world, people who had been deemed inconvenient or unimportant. They were drawn not just by the promise of water, but by the story of the man who had refused to be erased. Samuel, at 92, became an unlikely founder. He didn't lead them with speeches or rules. He led by example, with the quiet wisdom of his years and the precious gift of Eleanor's knowledge. He taught them how to read the land, how to respect its hidden strengths and weaknesses. He shared the seeds from his own small garden. A community began to grow, a settlement built not on a straight line of profit, but on the cooperative principles of survival and mutual respect. They called the settlement Eleanor's Hope. The name was fitting. It was a place born from her foresight, nurtured by his resilience. The sound of hammers replaced the threatened scream of the train. The laughter of children filled the air that had once held only the lonely cry of the wind. Samuel would sit on his porch in the evenings, the aches in his bones a familiar companion, and watch the lamps flicker on in the handful of new homes dotting the basin. He had not just saved his cabin. He had cultivated a future. He had proven that one person, armed with knowledge, purpose, and an unbreakable will, could bend the course of progress toward life, not destruction. He had faced the end and had instead built a new beginning, a final, beautiful testament to a love that was as deep and enduring as the aquifer flowing silently beneath them all. You will be underestimated. They will draw their lines across your life and call it the future. But they do not know the maps you hold, the secret knowledge you have stored away. Do not fight them on their terms. Build your well. Find your water. Create a value they are blind to. Your greatest act of defiance is not to resist their world, but to build your own.